The MotoGP grid returned to Brazil for the first time following a 22-year absence, and although the race wasn't necessarily a classic, the weekend could be considered a classic for all the wrong reasons. Just to name a few: rain delays, the track breaking up, a reduced distance race on Sunday, a delayed sprint, just to name a few. It was certainly an interesting return to Brazil for the first time since 2004. I always welcome a new track. Whether the track was the best for overtaking, I'm not sure, but to be back in Brazil, replacing Argentina, which I think is a good track anyway, but being back in Brazil is always nice. So let's get straight into the action then, starting with practice. Now, I only watched practice 1, I didn't get to watch practice 2, but such were the mixed conditions in practice 2 that Digi, which isn't huge in itself, but that'll be consequential later on, and Marco Bezzecchi, who won the last full race in Thailand, of course, both went through Q1. Very much a mixed up crew of riders going through to Q2, with Johan Zarco topping the practice session, Marquez P2 and Toprak in P3. Very much his highlight of his season so far. A very nice job from Toprak. I didn't catch qualifying either this week because I was out, so I only saw the grid on the sprint race, but I had a look at the timesheet. But in qualifying 1, I talked about both Digi and Bez going through that first session, and it was those two riders that prevailed in that session, quite convincingly really. Bez set a 1:17.4, Digi a 1:17.5. The next best was Johan Mir on 1:17.7, and then Diego Moreira on a 1:17.8, with Frankie Morbidelli setting the same time. But with Q2, as we've seen in previous seasons, with the two riders being warmed up from Q1, it was Digi and Bez that took the top 2 spots on the grid for the main 2 races. Possibly not in the order you might expect though. It was Digi who got pole from Bez with a time 2 thousandths out of Bez's Q1 time, and Bez 700ths behind him. Marquez was P3, and another shock Yamaha on the second row. It wasn't Toprak this time, it was Fabio Quartararo, a shock P4 within a 10th and a half of pole. A great position, but Quartararo must have been dreading it in some ways, because it is fair to say that Yamaha is probably the weakest package on the grid as they get used to this new V4 package. So Quartararo, such as he saw last season, might well be falling down the grid. More on that later on. A solid day for Aprilia again though in qualifying, with Bezzecchi P2, Jorge Martin in P5, Oyagura P6. The only one that didn't really perform was Raul Fernandez, quite a way down. Aldeguer back on the pace. He returned this weekend after an injury and out-qualified his teammate Alex Marquez. The top KTM was only P9, with Pedro Acosta, no surprise, helming that. Johan Zarco, although he made it straight through to Q2 in the wet conditions, couldn't do quite as well, but still a solid start inside the top 10 for the 2 races. Pecco Bagnaia P11 and Toprak in P12 making up row 4. Pecco 7/10ths off Marc Marquez and 4/10ths off the closest Ducati, Alex Marquez. Not a good Saturday morning at least for Pecco Bagnaia. So on to the sprint then. A poor start from Marco Bezzecchi, dropping behind both Marc and Fabio Quartararo before Fabio got past Marc quite early on. And being a Marc fan, I was going, no, you can't drop behind the Yamaha, that's the win. Completely gone. Better start from Marc, but not dissimilar to Thailand or really last season on many occasions, where Marc seems to struggle in the early laps. After about 3 or 4 laps he gets to grips with things, but he can get picked off in those early laps, and if the leader can get a bit of a gap, then that can produce a little bit of a problem for Marc Marquez catching up a little bit late. Nevertheless, Marc Marquez got back past Fabio Quartararo on the start-finish straight, one of the 5 longest straights of the season. I think it's 900 odd metres, the longest one being around 1100 metres. That might well be Austin. I think it could well be Austin, not the front straight, so I'd guess it'd be the back straight that's probably the longest of the 2. He was still 7/10ths behind Digi though, which, considering that Digi had got some good pace this weekend, wasn't a formality for Marc Marquez to go and catch up. And he did get a couple of attempts behind and benefited from a mistake from Fabio out of the what I think is quite awkward chicane. We saw in the race that Jorge Martin got it all wrong and nearly dropped position, but he was okay. But it was a very awkward chicane for the bikes to get through. And that saw Marc Marquez take P1 for the first time in the race. And Digi, despite being very close, and that was a good thing for the race, both in terms of entertainment, but for the main race for Digi as well, knowing that he had got the pace. But he couldn't quite get anywhere near Marc Marquez in terms of making an overtake. But I was under the impression from that sprint race, such was the way that Ducati were quite a way clear of Aprilia. They were 3.5 seconds ahead, Marc was, of Jorge Martin, who took P3 at the end. I felt from this that Ducati were quicker than Aprilia on race pace. But Jorge Martin got on the podium in P3. 3 Aprilias in the top 5. I think that happened in the last race as well, didn't it? Bezzecchi P4, Agura P5, Raul Fernandez unfortunately only P12 for him. But Fabio Quartararo with a really spirited performance, holding on to P6 in the sprint. Only 2.5 seconds behind Agura in what I think was a 15-lap race. So a pretty competitive performance from Fabio. He held up 2 Ducatis in Alex Marquez and Pecco Bagnaia. Unfortunately for Fermin Aldeguer on his return, he had a poor start, so only turned out to finish in P14. And as I alluded to a little bit earlier, naively going into Sunday, I thought it was a 2-horse race. And I suppose it turned out to be a 2-horse race. It just wasn't the 2 horses that I'd backed. It wasn't the 2 Ducatis, it was the 2 Aprilias in the end. But it was Marc Marquez's first win of the season. Didn't pick up a win in Thailand. He got the win temporarily in the sprint race, but that was taken off him. So his first win of the season, some much needed points, and I think even early on, I might be reading a little bit too much, but even early on for Marc Marquez, he needs to make sure he keeps with Marco Bezzecchi. So 6 points gained on what I'd say would be his main rival over the season in Marco Bezzecchi, and exciting to see Digi up there giving some competition. And once again, the sprint race, as did the main race, just shows the importance of qualifying. If we look at Pecco Bagnaia, he only started P11, which really limited his abilities, and only finished in P8 in the sprint. Going on to the main race, though, on Sunday, which there was another twist in the tale. I haven't really covered it in detail in the sprint, that the sprint was delayed by 1 hour and 20, such were the adverse weather conditions. The race was affected by a sinkhole on the start-finish straight. These things you couldn't really make up. But we got underway, but because of the track degradation and for safety concerns, the race was reduced to 25 laps. I think it was meant to be 31 laps. And apparently, Davide Tartozzi, the Ducati team manager, was apoplectic on the grid. But I honestly don't think the shortened distance really made that much difference, particularly with the race that we got in the end. But it was a better start from Marco Bezzecchi this time. He got the whole shot, and as with Thailand, that proved crucial to Bezzecchi securing the main race win. So that's 2 in a row for Marco Bezzecchi in the main races. That was something that Marc Marquez benefited from last year. When he got away, he can get into his rhythm, and bang, he didn't get disrupted. It was a better start from Pedro Acosta as well. I think he might have been on the soft rear. I could be wrong, but I think he might have been on the soft rear. And he got up to P4 at the end of the second lap. And if we go to the end of lap 5, Marco Bezzecchi was already 1.8 seconds clear. And I think that was somewhat because it felt like Marc Marquez was holding up the rest a little bit. I've talked about the fact that it takes him a couple of laps to get to grips with things, and it took him quite a while to get to grips with things in this race. So I'm not sure that Marc was ever really at 100% in the main race. But after that, a bit of a scrap ensued. Digi went up the inside and ran them both wide, not to the point that went off the track, but very much off the racing line. And Jorge Martin, being the savvy racer that he is, overtook both of them and then pulled clear. But Digi did make the move on Marc and made it stick. And Marc tried to get onto the podium. I mean, he really tried, to the point where I'll show this picture. It's a great picture where both bikes were touching with the one move. And I don't really think, as I alluded to, that he had quite what it took to outdo Digi. And that was testament to Fabio's pace this weekend. Remember that Fabio is on the 2026 bike, so he's on the same kit, really, as Marc Marquez. 3 Aprilias in the top 5 once again. Agura again got to P5. I think he had a good qualifying, didn't he? Yeah, he was in P6 in qualifying, so that helped him this weekend as opposed to Thailand, where he had to get through the grid. But a very solid P5 for him. Alex Marquez, P6. Pedro Acosta, a decent P7, but nowhere near the heights of Thailand. I think that Acosta pretty much expected that in Brazil, and I think he hinted that Thailand might have well flattered KTM to an extent to where they really are, in that it was Aprilia and Ducati being the top 2 manufacturers, really. Aldeguer, though, had a better start in the main race, particularly considering that his injuries and the fitness that he would have. He managed to get a solid P8. Johan Zarco P9, and Fernandez once again nowhere near the rest of the Aprilia gang in P10. But there were 4 DNFs. Unfortunately, Johan Mir crashed. 2 DNFs in the 2 main races this year. And again, Johan Mir, who, when he won the championship and a little bit after that, wasn't known to be a crasher, but on this Honda, he is very prone to crashing. Had a lot of crashes, I think, on that first year in the Honda. So that was disappointing, but I think he was running quite well, P7 or P8 when he crashed. Miller, Binder both crashed, so especially Jack Miller, nothing massive in terms of the results. But Pecco Bagnaia also crashed. And I saw this on Facebook. I don't know whether this is all true or a little bit of a meme, if you like. I think Bezzecchi, I don't know if it's every race, but I felt that what the picture was trying to show was every time Bezzecchi's won, Bagnaia has been on his backside off the bike. So if that is something that's took place, then that is a little bit worrying. But Bagnaia crashed, a high-speed crash at, I think it was turn 1 that Bagnaia came out. And it has been a poor start to Pecco Bagnaia this season. We thought that last year was maybe a bit of a one-off and that Pecco Bagnaia would come back fighting, but on the evidence of these first 2 races, in qualifying he wasn't there and we didn't see Bagnaia really at all during the race. Only on 10 points, 13th in the championship. Think at this point that Marc Marquez, even with that DNF in Thailand, is on 34. Marco Bezzecchi, the championship leader, is on 56. Considering that you can get 74 is the most points that you can get. Bezzecchi's had a very strong start to the season on 56, and Jorge Martin makes it a top 2 in the championship for Aprilia, but Bagnaia only on 10 points after this. So a disaster for him. So as a summary really for each of the manufacturers at this point, another very good weekend for Aprilia. And that was for both factory riders, not just Bezzecchi, but Jorge Martin. One of the big positives of this weekend is that Jorge Martin this weekend looks back on the pace, and I think that a MotoGP with Jorge Martin on the pace is a better MotoGP for it, especially this year where it could be just Bezzecchi against Marquez. To get Jorge Martin back in that race, that's great. In terms of Marc Marquez and the Ducati, both a sprint and a race result for him. That's key to get a bit of consistency. Just a pity that he retired really with that tyre failure in Thailand, because that would have been another decent result. I think he was P4 at that point. But another bad day at the office on Sunday for Pecco. You have to feel it all started really with only qualifying P11. Quite a way down the grid. And quite a way down in terms of times as well. It's not like it was close on Saturday. And then Sunday, the sprint was held up a little bit behind Quartararo. And then on Sunday, didn't really get going. He was P14 in the early running. I don't know where he got to, where he crashed, but it wasn't anything that was spectacular. And I can't remember whether it was Gavin Emmett or Neil Hodgson. I think it was Gav on the TNT Sports coverage called it a disaster. And that was before Pecco Bagnaia crashed, so it wasn't just the crash that was a disaster. In terms of KTM, they didn't have the raw pace. Pedro Acosta again starring with the kit that he's got. Brad Binder had a crash in the main race, and the 2 tech-free guys just weren't there this weekend, even though Maverick Vinales is being coached by Jorge Lorenzo. Not a great weekend for him in Brazil. In terms of Honda, it was a fairly quiet weekend for them, apart from Zarco topping a practice session, although Johan Mir ran quite well before another crash. And Honda have definitely improved, haven't they, to be in a mid-grid team. I don't think they're going to pull any shocks particularly massively this season unless we get some rain and Johan Zarco maybe picks up another good result, the likes of what we saw in Le Mans last year. But Diego Moreira, the rookie, has had a good start. Luca Marini didn't have a great weekend. He was quite a way down the grid, and such as we've said from qualifying, that really thwarts from what you can do in the main race. And the highlight, I think, for Yamaha was Quartararo's qualifying. He held on well in the sprint. It was a disaster in the main race for Quartararo. He fell back, but that sprint result very much a highlight for Yamaha, and if nothing else, a little bit of a morale boost. So what does that mean for the rest of the season? Well, is it too early to say that Aprilia can take it to Ducati all season? Possibly. But I think the signs are definitely good for them. There's no question about that. They've took 2 of the first 4 wins. It was KTM in the sprint in Thailand, then it was Aprilia in the main race, then Ducati in the sprint. Maybe if it had been a better start for Bezzecchi or even Jorge Martin, then they could have challenged possibly in the sprint, but it didn't happen. And it's positive for Digi that he was up there as well. If we can get that core 3 or 4 challenging that is really positive, with some appearances from Pedro Acosta. Hopefully Pecco Bagnaia can pick up some pace, and we've got maybe 6 or 7 riders in the running for each race weekend. It's that variability that makes things exciting, and even though I'm a Marc Marquez fan, if it was just Marc every weekend, it starts to get a little bit boring. It's all about the stakes and the excitement, isn't it, ultimately? But I think the most exciting thing about this weekend was how good Jorge Martin was. If it is indeed that Aprilia have got the best bike, then we want to see 2 top riders on that bike dicing it out, with Marc Marquez battling, I think, on whatever machinery he's got. Whether that Ducati is good enough, I don't think necessarily it was quite good enough, or whether it was a mixture of Marc's fitness still not being at 100% and the Ducati, I guess none of us really know for sure. But if we've got a good Aprilia, then both riders being there is a positive. And Jorge Martin was only a few seconds behind Bez in the main race, and he beat him in the sprint too. And you could Caveat that by saying in the main race that maybe once Bez had got the gap, he wasn't quite going 100%. He was being closed down a little bit at one point, but in the late period, I don't think he was going 100%. But nevertheless, to take things at face value, to be close behind is positive. So it's very much advantage of Aprilia so far in the championship. Fortunately, we haven't got to wait 3 weeks for the next race on this occasion because we go to Texas next weekend, which you would have to say Marc Marquez's favourite for that race, haven't you? Such as the prowess of Marc Marquez over the years here. But he is prone to a crash. I think it was a few years ago that Marc crashed. He crashed at least once out of Coates from the lead, I distinctly remember. He crashed out last season, didn't he, from the lead? Pecco Bagnaia went and won that rain race, and I was very much, Pecco's only won that because Marc Marquez has retired out of the race. But that was probably one of the highlights for Pecco last year, so we'll let him have it, eh? But only a week until that race in Texas. Great track. I think it's actually a better track for the bikes than the cars is COTA, to be quite honest. But unfortunately, after that, with the Middle East crisis, we do have quite a gap then before we go to Jerez. But hopefully I'll be back with another one of these reviews after the next weekend. I enjoy doing these. I enjoyed doing the first one as well, and that one seemed to do well. So if you enjoyed this, then to help us be found in the algorithm, I'd really appreciate if you can give a like, comment your thoughts down below as well, share this with any friends or anybody that might be interested, and subscribe for regular MotoGP reviews or any sort of sporting content that I would like to produce. But thank you for your company. I hope you've enjoyed this roundup, some personal views on what happened this weekend, but generally speaking, more of a summary review of the Brazilian Grand Prix. And hopefully, I'll see you next weekend for the American Grand Prix review. I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are too.